Welcome to this special episode of CP Newswatch. I'm Kathleen Harris, Ottawa Bureau Chief at the Canadian Press. We're now just 1 month away from the U.S. election, when the entire world will be watching to see who will become the next president. We all know the story by now. Former Republican President Donald Trump versus current Democratic VP Kamala Harris. She rose to the top of the ticket after Joe Biden withdrew from the race in the summer. Red versus blue, conservative versus liberal. And if the polls are correct, right now it's a toss-up. It's that close. Of course, Canada has much at stake in this election. Not only is the U.S. our largest trading partner, but the next administration could have a big impact on life in the U.S. and on this side of the border. The economy, the environment, safety, security, the list goes on. Canadian Press Washington correspondent Kelly Malone is our lead reporter on the election and has a front row seat for this historic campaign. Kelly and I will have a chat every week between now and November 5th for this podcast, bringing you stories from the road, key moments, and the latest on what experts and voters are saying leading up to Election Day. So consider this part 1 of 4, and let's go to Washington. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for doing this.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You just spent some time in battleground states in the Midwest, which are a key focus for both of the presidential campaigns. And while there have always been differences of political opinion in America, those divisions seem to be running a lot deeper these days, especially in states like Wisconsin, where Democratic-leaning areas sit alongside staunchly Republican districts. You've been speaking with a lot of people in Wisconsin this week, Kelly. What are you hearing?
I heard a lot of different points of view from people. Some people were saying they felt that it was intensely politically polarized, that they felt uncomfortable talking with friends and neighbors about politics, that they had people coming to their door with signs and leaflets about candidates, and they felt uncomfortable actually talking about it. Other people I spoke with were truly unfazed by it all. So I think that there is a real mix of opinion in the area, depending on where you are, who you are, and what your priorities are. But I think one place where it was really clear what was happening was in West Bend. It's a county that's just north of Milwaukee, and Republicans love to say it's one of the reddest counties in the area. There I met Mary Herrick. So she's 76 and she's lived in Washington County for 50 years. But this is the first time in an election where she feels that she's having really uncomfortable moments with her neighbors and with her friends. So she told me about going out for lunch with a friend who was also a teacher. Mary is a retired teacher, and their conversation turned to politics. So let's jump and hear her talk about what happened next.
I opened my big mouth and I said, well, do you know who you're voting for? And she said, well, yes, Trump. And I think my jaw probably hit the floor. And I said, oh, well, I'm Kamala. And not another word was said. And when I got home, I mentioned to my husband, and he said, well, Mary, you probably just should have said to her, what is it about Trump that makes you want to vote for him? What are his policies that have you decided that that's who you're going to vote for? And I said, well, I just couldn't say anything. I don't understand why people would vote for him. But anyway.
So that was really interesting, but it's not just, people like Mary. I also spoke with Donna Haas. She's 65 years old and also lives in West Bend. And she said, she's pretty comfortable around her neighbors. They're all big Trump supporters and she doesn't feel polarized. But that's not the case with her family members. And so here's her talking about how the election has changed the relationship with her son.
Neighbor to neighbor is okay because we're predominantly Trump country.
Yeah.
But I have one son that doesn't like to talk to me because he's a lefty. So it's horrible. I mean, you can't even talk to your own kid. And that's just because of all the rhetoric.
So interesting. So what are the pollsters? I know the pollsters are looking very closely at this issue and how it plays out during the campaign. What do they have to say?
Well, overall, the country's two major parties sit at virtual parity. About half of registered voters, 49%, lean towards the Democratic Party, while 48% lean Republican. So that really doesn't leave a whole lot of people in the middle who are going to decide this election. In Wisconsin, Trump took the state in 2016, defeating Hillary Clinton by roughly 23,000 votes. That's less than a percentage margin. And then it flipped back to Biden in 2020 by another extremely tight margin. So when you look at these elections, and what's great is you can see the colorized maps of how elections turn out and go back year over year. And that really shows you through color, through image, just how close these elections are. Like red districts sit beside blue districts. You can see that there's a real urban divide in that Milwaukee, Madison, the state capital and a university city, they are brightly blue, as are the suburbs around them. And they slowly get less blue. And then you start seeing staunchly red districts as you move into the more rural and smaller communities. And the state's seen its political division play out in numerous ways beyond the presidential ticket. Until very recently, Wisconsin was considered one of the most gerrymandered states in the US, and people describe the appearance of its electoral maps as Swiss cheese. Its senators, conservative Republican Ron Johnson and liberal Democrat Tammy Baldwin, literally could not be further apart on nearly every core issue. So polling really shows us that in this state, neighbors and neighbors sitting beside each other are coming at this election with increasingly different views.
So a lot more clear red and clear blue and not so much purple these days.
Exactly.
So what are the experts saying about what is causing this heightened polarization? What's fueling some of these trends?
I spoke with the University of Pennsylvania's Mark Trussler. He's the director of data science for the university's program on opinion research and election studies. And one thing I always like about talking with him is he's actually originally Canadian. So he has really good contacts from both sides and both point of view, and also knows what I'm invested in talking about from a Canadian standpoint. He said that what we're really seeing is elections start to feel more existential because voting no longer is about people having different ideas about policy. They're really starting to shape their identity about how they feel about specific parties. One of the examples he used was like back in the day, the Democratic Party was the party of African Americans, but also the party of union workers. And often that was kind of your Midwestern white male. And that's becoming less and less the case with the Democratic Party as they change. And even in this election, polling is showing them losing the male vote in different areas, the younger male vote, including the Black younger male vote and the Hispanic younger male vote. They still overwhelmingly vote Democrat, but they're losing them in some capacities. And Trussler explained that some of this is also linked to education polarity. So in the polling, you're seeing people with the college degree overwhelmingly voting Democrat, no matter race, age, gender, any of that kind of stuff coming in, and people without a college degree overwhelmingly voting Republican. And that's been a shift that you've seen play out at the same time as people see politics differently and more in a way that shapes their identity rather than a party that they support because of policies. So a recent survey in Wisconsin found that 46% of people polled stopped talking to someone about politics because of this presidential race. And I think what Trussler is talking about, you see that play out when you look at this poll. And in Wisconsin, it also means that you're starting to see conspiracy theories. You're starting to see fractures amongst people and anger, including after the 2020 election, where it became one of the places where they were making the wild claims about voter fraud because of mail-in ballots. And if you remember, 2020 was a pandemic election, so there were a lot of mail-in ballots, but they ended up having to do an independent inquiry that found no evidence that this was the case. But talking with people in Wisconsin, there's still a belief that this is happening. So I spoke with Allison Prash. She's an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an expert on U.S. presidential rhetoric. And she said there's been a change in rhetoric and how it's being used in this election. And it is tapping into that sense of identity, that you have to vote for Trump or America's at stake, or you have to vote for Harris or America's at stake. And so when you have neighbors who are on the opposite side of this, living beside each other, both believing their futures are at stake, depending on what happens in November, it's a setup for there to be real clashes among friends and family.
It's really interesting, those rifts that we're seeing in families, communities right across the country. So I'm sure you'll be watching this in the final weeks of the campaign and watching how this plays out. And what else are you going to be keeping an eye on up till November 5th?
Well, one of the things that polling is really starting to show is this might be the greatest gender divide in an election coming up. So that's something that I'm watching closely, seeing how much that's shifting amongst people who are voting, and what that means for kind of the future of politics. Obviously, I will also be watching for any further information about policies that might have an impact on Canada, including the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, what they intend to do for NATO, support for Ukraine, things that Canadians really care about. And I'm also keeping an eye on, because we haven't heard a whole lot, is where do the parties stand on the environment? So those are some of the things that I'm interested in the weeks to come.
Can't wait to read and hear more about it. Thanks very much, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
That was Kelly Malone, our Washington correspondent for the Canadian Press.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. For more of today's top stories, visit thecanadianpressnews.ca.